Greetings ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's Reddit series video from the subreddit HFY called Ch.8 Liberated, written by some guy named Ted. The hot afternoon sun beat down on his head from a high perch in the sky, with Nerdon swiped his hand impotently in front of his face, trying to clear the bugs. They had to be the worst thing about this planet, followed by the heat and the thick foliage. He forced his way through said foliage with a growl, the weeds tugging at his boot clasps. How do beings live here? He wondered. His rifle strap caught on a branch on the third time, and Nerdon paused, taking the time to remove it properly. If the swarm soldier was taught one thing, it was that your rifle was the most important thing you possessed. If a swarm soldier was found to have neglected his rifle during peace or war, he would be strung up by his feet and his tusks were sawn off. It was a harsh, but it ensured that the swarm soldiers always had functioning weapons. An insect bit his neck and Nerdon slapped at it with his meaty hand, missing it. Just my luck, he thought. Assigned patrol on a deserted planet while there are hundreds of fresh slaves waiting for me. His skin prickled at the thought. There was one particularly pretty Thorathi that he had captured during the first night. He could still remember how she'd squirmed. He shivered with the thought. A branch cracked in front of him, and he halted, readying his rifle. "Show yourself," he ordered. Maybe there was a new slave for him. The biggest being Nerdon had ever seen stepped out from behind a tree, dressed in a deep red shirt, brown pants, and a brown coat, with a wide brim hat on top of his head. The being stood a head over Nerdon. "Relax," said the being. "I'm on your side." Nerdon doubted that, and his mind registered what the being had said, or rather how he had said it. The being had spoken in perfect Swerner. Not only that, but he had used the Imperial dialect, only spoke by the Imperial family and those close to them. No swarm could dare to use a dialect unless they were willing to be cast into the chasms. But this being was no swarm. Nerdon did not know what to do. This being was not a swarm or one of the subject races, and therefore an enemy of the Empire. But he spoke perfect Imperial dialect, which he could have only learned from the Imperial family. He must have been a trusted ally for them to teach him. His internal conflict settled, Nerdon lowered his rifle. "What is your business here?" he asked the being. "I didn't see you on the carrier." Granted, it had been a large carrier, but you got to know those you fought besides. "I came on another ship after the attack. As for my business, I'm here for you." The being stepped closer. There was something odd about him, other than the size, but Nerdon could not place it. "For me?" he asked in surprise. "What for?" "Well," said the being, stepping a few feet in front of Nerdon. The oddness screamed at Nerdon, but for the life of him, he could not place it. "I'm actually here for you. I just need that communicator of yours." He pointed a long finger at Nerdon's chest, at the black box at his chest. When the being gestured, Nerdon realized what was so odd about the being. His left hand was metal. "Oh, crap," thought Nerdon, looking at horror Clint Stone, known throughout the army as a violent rebel with a penchant for leaving dead swarm in his path. He was so shocked at seeing this wolfist, his rifle hung at his side, barrel pointed uselessly at the ground. Clint looked down at his hand and grimaced. "I should really get a glove or something. Don't you agree? Not that it matters." He looked up at Nerdon and his face split into a wide smile. It looked like a smile of the Grecian shark, a full of bony white teeth of pure savagery. The last thing Nerdon saw before the metal fist caved in his head was that smile, flashing in the sun. Gem ran through the woods where he had once hunted for game, followed closely by a swarm soldier. He had stumbled upon the soldier, quite literally running into him, when he had been scouting out the slave pen. He cut quickly loose of the trees and ducking under the branches and dodging the roots. Despite his speed, the swarm soldier was catching up. Also, the swarm must have thought. In reality, this was exactly what Gem had wanted to happen. He slowed down just a little more, allowing the swarm to get just that much closer. Gem could have run circles around him if he'd wished, but it was necessary for the swarm to think that Gem was another survivor, wandering lost after the attack. He had played it off while bumbling around the woods, making enough noise to wake the dead. He had run into the swarm to get its attention, since he had not seemed to notice the rustling branches and crunching leaves. The swarm had ordered him to stop, but Jem just took off. He ran through the woods, breathing easily. He could hear the swarm ragged breathing as he gained on Jem. Seeing the protruding root, Jem stuck his foot under it. Falling to the ground, the swarm crashed into him, driving Jem's breath from his lungs. "Got you, you bastard!" croaked the swarm between gasping breaths. He secured Jem's hands behind his back with a pair of quick-sealing handcuffs. Pulling Jem roughly to his feet, the swarm poked at his sides. "You gave me quite the chase, grasshopper. Looks like it's a slave pits for you." Tugging Jem's arm sharply, the swarm led him off in the direction of the troop carrier and the slave pens. They went much slower than way back than they had gone away, so it took a while to reach the carrier. They stepped out of the trees onto a large clearing that had been, until recently, the spaceport for B.R.E. Jem could still see the outline of the trading post where he had sold his hunting scores. It was now a burned foundation on which rested a giant ship. Towering 100 feet in the air and over 1,000 feet long, the troop carrier was a basic ship of the swarm armies. With the capacity of over 10,000 soldiers, it was the ideal ship for landing assault troopers or collecting slaves. On B.R.E. it was being used for the latter. Jem could see that the remainder of the inhabitants of B.R.E. corralled in a plasma fence-enclosed area. He prayed his family was amongst them. Ch.8 had said that the village had looked undisturbed, that it was more likely the swarm had just rounded them up and taken them into the pens. It was the villagers closer to the carrier that had been destroyed, the villagers killed, or worse. Jem had heard the stories of what some of the swarm soldiers did to the female slaves they captured. Jem prayed with all of his might that all the gods above that his daughter was safe. He was dragged by the swarm that had captured him to the crude gate and set the plasma fence protecting the carrier. A single guard strode in front of him, holding up a hand. "State your business." "What do you think my business is?" said the swarm that had captured Jem. "I got a slave here." "Then take him to the pens. No slaves in common, for any reason." The swarm seemed to frown. It was a gruesome sight. "The commander has forbidden any more visits to our slaves, says they lessen the value." The guard spit, making an opinion on the subject clear, but he would not disobey. The 3 principles of the swarm army were discipline, skill, and ruthlessness. On those, discipline was the most important. Any soldier who disobeyed was executed on the spot. The swarm that had captured Jem returned without a word and dragged him back to the smaller gate set in the separate plasma fence that made up the slave pen. There were no guards at this gate, just a large barred barrier charged with plasma. A single touch would incinerate the body part unfortunate enough to make contact with it. It made an effective guard by itself. The swarm pushed a button set several feet from the gate and the plasma cut off. He raised his rifle and barked at the captors to move towards the gate. "If any of you make one more step, I'm blowing your brains all over your friends." They backed off. The swarm shoved Jem towards the gate. Opening the gate, he pushed Jem inside. "Enjoy your stay," the swarm said with a grin. "I don't expect it will be long." The gate glowed with plasma as the swarm re-energized it and walked away. Jem turned to the other captors. He did not recognize any of them, but there was a good 6,000 in here. There was hardly any room to move. Everyone pressed shoulder to shoulder, but there was a good 8 feet between the fence and the huddled masses. Jem did not blame them. The rest of the beings stared at Jem as he pushed through them, shouting his wife's name. His eyes darted in every direction, searching on all sides. Despite his vision being full circle around his head, he could not see any trace of his family. He prayed that they were still alive. He would find his kids with his wife and they would get them out. That was the goal right now. He had been sent to get out as many as possible, but if he had to make the choice, he would get his family out first. He knew that he shouldn't think like that, but he did not care. The mass of beings were almost too much to fight through, but Jem forced his way through anyway, driven by fear. He pushed through from one side of the pen to the opposite and then back in a different direction. He saw no sign of them. His heart sank, but he still searched for them. By the minute his heart grew heavier, and he knew that he would never find them. They were dead and he would never see them again. Then a wonderful sound met his ears. "Jem!" The rear eyes focused on the being who had spoken. He spun around and saw his wife, Ira, standing there. his daughter and son by his side. He rushed to them and gathered them in his arms, tears streaming down his face. His children leapt into his arms, hugging him tight. No matter what he had done in the past, he was their father, and they had missed him. His wife was much colder, still angry with him for his lies, but she was in the middle of a slave pen, to be shipped out across the galaxy to God knows where, and someone that she had thought long gone had returned. She stepped into his hug, returning it, weakly at first, and then with the greatest strength. They stayed like that for a long time, a small island of happiness in a sea of misery. The world that they knew was gone, taken by the swarm, but they had found each other. He stepped back eventually and looked them over for any injuries. Just a few scrapes and bruises, but nothing serious. Kira looked at him in the eyes. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her face full of disbelief. "I thought you'd left Berea." Jem nodded. "I did. And then I rejoined the rebellion, got promoted to unit captain, and then I heard about Swarm invading Berea. I had to save you, so here I am." Kira looked like she had a great deal to say to him, but she said, "How do you plan on getting us out of here then, The fence will fry you if you get too close to it, and there is an army out there." Jem held at his arm, showing her the white suit he was wearing. "With this and a little help from my friends." The suit was made of a truly wondrous substance that could stop plasma fire. Clint had tried to explain what it was made of, but Jem understood very little of it. What he did know was that Clint had emptied a pistol into it. The suit had not been damaged, but Clint said it redirected the energy through the series of minuscule tubes to and all around the body, turning what would have been a fatal burst of energy and heat into a slight warming sensation. He had warned that too much plasma would overload the suit and cook the wearer alive. But it took a lot of energy to do that. When Jem had first told them his plan, he had involved several of the team sneaking and disabling the fence to get everyone out. When Clint had shown them the plasma suits, Jem had realized that there was a better plan. Jem had planned to use it to short-circuit the plasma fence, allowing it to be climbed, but now that he knew the gate was unguarded, he would just open the gate. The swarm had not secured it, trusting in the threat of incineration to deter escape attempts. It would have worked, too, if not for Clint Stone and his creative mind. Jem had seen several more things Clint had been building, and, while he did not understand what most of them did, they all looked like they could do some serious damage to the swarm. The rest would provide a distraction, drawing out the soldiers while Jem led the captives onto the carrier, or out into the woods, whichever was the safest bet. It was likely to be the woods because, with 1,000 soldiers, some of them would stay back and protect the carrier. After the captives had fled into the woods, the soldiers would follow them, hopefully in small enough groups for the hunters to dispatch them. It would be a long, bloody affair, but it really only the option when 6 faced 1,000. Now they just had to wait for the distraction. Jua rested on a slight rise above the carrier, watching the swarm camp. They looked like insects from here, scurrying here and there. He watched as Jem was taken to the main camp, where they paused for a moment at the gate. Then he headed for the slave pen. Jua had followed them since Jem had been captured, watching to make sure that Jem was not harmed. The swarm soldier had been oblivious to his presence, but most beings would have been. Jua was a master of silent movement. Before he was Jua, they had called him Wraith, because he moved quieter than a ghost. Fire burned, meat tastes good, and Jua was silent. He watched as Jem merged with the mass of captives. Then he lost him. It did not matter. Jem had gotten in and Jua was needed elsewhere. He pushed himself up from his prone position, heading in the direction of Susan. As he moved around the camp, he saw a large group of swarm soldiers gather their weapons and march off into the woods. There were perhaps 200 of them, a good fifth of the swarm forces. Clint's part of the plan was, in effect, Clint had provided an addition to Jem's plan, one that involved a lot of dead swarm. He would draw out a large number of soldiers, killing a scout and taking his communicator, then pretending to be the scout, having found a large group of survivors with weapons. He had mentioned something to Jem about caves, but Jua did not know what that meant by that. But Clint had said that he was going to take care of the soldiers. Jua assumed that meant that he was going to kill them all. He did not know how, but the human had sounded confident that he could do it. Jua did not worry himself with the details. He was to watch Jem until he had been taken to the slave pen, and then to return to Susan. He had watched Jem, and so he returned to the ship. The sun was setting quickly. The hunters got into position around the swarm camp. Arnholtz clutched the large rifle in his hands and shifted his shoulders, trying to adjust the suit that he was wearing under his clothes. It was a strange-feeling suit, light in weight but very heavy to the touch. He couldn't think of any other way to describe it. It was not thick or stiff, but it was heavy when it rested on his skin, as if it pushed against the surface. He shrugged again and rested his rifle on the branch in front of him, training it on the gate leading to the camp. He marveled at the spirit of these rebels, which he was now one of. He had to remind himself of the fact. Until recently, he had been a member of the Yatar militia and the Yatar system. It had been disbanded when the swarm took over, and most of the members had joined the rebels. Here he was, with 5 other beings who were supposedly some of the deadliest in the galaxy. He could believe it about the human and the Jahan. He had seen them fight the Ch.8, and the human was the single most skilled fighter W.R.E had ever seen. He would be a terror in the battlefield, and with that arm of his, he would be nearly unstoppable. The Jahan was something that he had never seen before. A Jahan was inherently selfish and cowardly. There was few exceptions, and there are exceptions to everything. But you could always count on a Jahan to do everything that he can for himself. For one to join the rebellion was a very selfish act, and the fact that he could fight was even stranger. Jahan did not fight. Ever. Not because of any beliefs they held, but because of their aversion to physical harm. But W.R.E did not dwell on it. He had a job to do, and soon he saw the signal. He was to open fire on any swarm that he could see. He set his sights on the gate and waited. The signal would be coming soon. About an hour ago, there had been a distant noise of plasma fire as Clint finished off 200 swarm soldiers that he'd led away. W.R.E did not know how he had managed to do it. He fully intended to ask the man after this was over, assuming that they were both still alive. 6 against 1,000 were very long odds. Drake was standing in the middle of the road leading right to the gate of the fence. He fingered his weapon in his hands, his large tube of metal, longer than his rifle by a foot. It had a grip and a large red-colored trigger in the grip. It was the largest missile launcher that he had ever handled, and he was eager for the chance. "Are you certain you can do this?" asked the Jahan at his side. "Are you kidding me? I'm looking forward to it," replied Drake with a grin. This was going to be amazing. The best part about being a sniper, he thought, is getting your target before they even know you exist. With this thing, he would be able to get a large amount of swarm with a single shot. "All right, fire," said TEDx. Drake did so gladly, aiming at the end of the tube at the gate. The plume of smoke and flame erupted from the back of the launcher, and the missile streaked towards the gate. It struck the gate full on, obliterating it in a flash and scorching heat. He could see the smoke rising from the breach and several burned bodies on the edge of the impact site. Those who had been in the middle had likely been blown into pieces. He grinned and snatched up his sniper rifle from the ground. He ran off into the hills searching for good cover. It was time to take out some swarm. I stood in the middle of the road, next to Drake. In the distance I could see the gate the swarm had erected in the middle of the plasma fence. We were going to blow it up. That would draw the remaining swarm soldiers to the gate and out into easy range of our weapons. The swarm had thought themselves clever when they had put the plasma fence to ward off threats. What they had done was build the trap for themselves. With only one way in or out, they could only respond to a threat after they had exited the camp. They could not fire through the fence links because their plasma charge would just absorb the energy from their weapons. So we were going to attack the gate, forcing them to respond, and they could come pouring out into the camp, but they would be hindered by a small gateway, with only enough room for 3 or 4 at a time. We could pick them off with ease as they tried to force their way throughout the camp. For that purpose, I had taken a minigun Clint had built from the secret arsenal, with 9 barrels and a whole lot of juice for plasma shots. This thing would take out a great deal of swarm before it ran empty. Forced into the narrow bottleneck of the gate, they would have nowhere to go when I opened fire. "Are you sure you can do this?" I asked Drake, who was holding a missile launcher and were going to use to blow up the gate. He grinned. "Are you kidding me? I'm looking forward to it." I readied the minigun, hoisting it up to waist height. "All right, "Fire," I said. He did so, a missile arcing from the end of the metal tube. The gate disappeared behind the flame and smoke. When it was visible again, the gate was gone, leaving a twisted, charred outline. Several dead swarm was visible by the burned ground on the edge of the explosion. Dake grabbed his sniper rifle and headed into the woods. From there, he would pick off as many swarm as possible. My heart raced as I waited for the first swarm to appear in the gap. I could hear the blood roaring in my ears. There's one. I depressed the trigger, and the handle that aligned the plasma flew from the end of my gun, punching through the swarm's body. Several more swarm appeared with the guns ready, but I dropped them all as well. The feeling of power in my hands was intoxicating. I could see the swarm trying to fire through the fence at me, but the plasma-charged links absorbed their shots, leaving me untouched. I laughed at their attempts to harm me. I let several soldiers exit the camp, allowing them to build up a nice group. They fired at me, but most of them missed or were deflected by my suit. I unleashed death upon them once again, filling them with the fire from my weapon. Still, the swarm forced their way through the gap in the fence, trying to get a shot at me. The one who had killed so many of their brethren. Let them try, I thought, sending several more swarm to the void. The fire left the end of my barrels in an arc as I swept the gun back and forth, creating a zone of death. There was a flicker of movement to my right, and I snapped my head towards it. In the trees was a swarm scout leveling his rifle at me. He must have been out on patrol when he attacked. No matter, he fired at me, striking me in the chest. My suit deflected the heat across my body, and I was unharmed. Before the swarm could register that I was still alive, I turned the minigun on him, shredding several trees and his body. I scanned the trees, searching for more, but I did not see any. A plasma shot inched its way in front of my face, and I remembered the hundreds of swarm trying to get out of the camp. I swung the gun back towards the gap and cut through a dozen more swarm. You would think that they would stop sending soldiers, I thought. But they didn't. A pile formed in the gap and several feet high. More soldiers climbed out of the gap, and I pulled the trigger. Nothing happened. Crap! The gun was out of energy. I dropped it and sprinted to the side of the road as the soldiers, expecting to be struck down with endless fire, realized that they weren't going to be killed and charged at me, guns blazing. Several shots passed dangerously close to my head as I ducked into the trees and ran. Jem heard a massive boom and saw a burst of flame coming from the gate of the soldiers' camp. TEDx must have started his part of the distraction. Time to get to work. He had spent the last few hours informing the prisoners what was going to happen in the evening. He told them that there was a plan to get them out, but only if they acted calmly and rationally. Jem didn't expect them to, but he tried anyway. He stepped up to the gate and threw his suit over several bars. He removed it earlier when Kira had pointed out the fence had a lot more energy than a rifle, and that if it didn't work that he would be fried. That was part of the reason he'd married her. She was very clever, always noticing things that he didn't. So he pulled off his suit, put his clothes back on, and threw the suit across the gate. Hopefully this would work. The gate was on a separate circuit from the fence. It had to be for the gate to be able to shut off and on. Gem hoped that meant that it was less power than the fence. The suit touched the gate with a blinding flash of light. When Jem could see again, he saw that the suit burned and blackened on the ground and the gate hanging dull and powerless. He touched it, hesitatingly, and checking to make sure that it was dead, as it looked. It was. He pushed it open and led his family through. He pulled them to the side, and the rest of the 6,000 prisoners pushed their way past. Now I either have to get on the carrier or back to Susan. No problem. Dake watched as Jem short-circuited the gate and rushed his family out of the pens, followed closely by the rest of the captives. He did not see any swarm near the pens, so he turned back to the camp. With the swarm, the many, dead or dying. He watched transfixed as the Johan fired the ridiculously big gun, cutting down swarm by the dozens. It was breathtaking to watch. Dake had never seen such devastation. That human really knew his way around a weapon. The rate at which it fired and the intensity of the shots was much farther than anything Dake had seen. The Johan seemed to be laughing. He was clearly mad, but it was the madness of battle, and Dake knew about that. The sense of absolute power when you held your opponent's life in your hands, you delivered judgment with finality. Swarm rushed out of the gap and the swarm died. There weren't even any left for Dake to kill. They died so fast. Dake did not know why they kept coming, even though they saw their comrades dying by the score. Then the scoring rain of fire ended with Dake knew why. They had hoped to use up the charge in the gun, depleting it and allowing the rest of their army to spill out from the breach, and with 800 soldiers, they certainly had the men to spare. Dake estimated that the number of dead, well, he thought, maybe around 500 now. So plenty enough left to finish off Dake and the rest. He lifted his rifle and shot a swarm clean through the heart. Dropping him, TEDx had retreated into the trees, and he was relying on the rest of them to distract the swarm long enough to get away, or far enough away to safely fire on the swarm at least. The whole point of this attack was to enrage the swarm enough to draw them out of the camp, so that he and W.R.E could sneak in and secure the carrier long enough for Jem to lead the captives on board. So far, it seemed to be working very well. As Dake watched, the swarm poured out of the ruins of the gate like ants from the upturned anthill. It looked like all the swarm had left except the skeleton crew of 20 sentries. Perfect. Dake signaled with W.R.E and they descended to the camp. W.R.E ran alongside the Jahan as they raced ahead of the large horde of angry swarm, plasma bolts flying around them. "I think we made them angry," shouted the Jahan. W.R.E did not respond. He rarely did to anyone. There was rarely any reason to. They kept running from the swarm, ducking under branches and dodging roots. A thought occurred to W.R.E, a thought worth saying. "Where are we running to?" he asked the Jahan. They seemed to be running in a generally straight direction, but it was not in the direction that anything that W.R.E knew. It was not back to the ship or to Jem's village. If he had remembered correctly from the flyover, there was a group of mountains in the direction that they were running, but nothing else. "We're going to where Clint is. Hopefully he's got a surprise ready for the swarm." Hopefully. They were running into a place where they did not know if there would be help or not. This Jahan was clearly put on a lot of faith in the human, enough to not seem troubled by the fact that they were running from hundreds of swarm who were trying their hardest to kill them. The trees started to thin, and the W.R.E looked worriedly around as they ran. Less trees would mean less cover. Less cover meant that the soldiers' aim would improve. Before them was a ground dropped away into a vast fen. Perfectly flat ground. Fire burned. Meat tasted good. And flat ground was very bad for running away from being shooting at you. But TEDx kept going and W.R.E kept going. They jumped over the drop into the fens, and TEDx stopped suddenly, putting himself against the edge of the drop. He grabbed the W.R.E, when he did not stop, he pushed him against the earthen blank. TEDx shouted back at the swarm, "Okay, we give up, you win." "Come out with your hands up," barked the swarm commander, who seemed a little short of breath. W.R.E turned to TEDx. This was important enough to speak. "There is no way they're going to let us live." The Jahan shrugged. "I know." W.R.E stared at him with his jaw hanging open. TEDx noticed and said, "As long as they don't kill us before Clint gets ya, we'll be fine. We just have to distract them long enough." He stood, pushing off the bank, and looked up into the gun barrels of the swarm standing above them. W.R.E sighed and did the same. His hands held high, resigned to his fate. TEDx put far too much faith in the human. Besides, what could a single being do against 500 swarm? The commander spoke. "You gave us quite a chase. Now tell me truthfully, and I will let you die quickly. Where is the rest of your army?" TEDx laughed. "There is no one else. It was just me and him. I killed all of those soldiers." The commander chuckled. It was not a pleasant sound. "That is even more ridiculous than the tales of giant lizards on this planet. Tell me what I want to know, or I'll empty your skull of its brains." He held up his pistol at TEDx's head. "I am going to kill you. Perhaps your friend will be more cooperative." TEDx grinned. "It's too late for that." "What?" grunted the commander. A near-splitting roar shattered the air, followed by several more. The swarm soldiers spun their heads around, searching for the source of the sound. TEDx's grin broke into the open smile. "He's here," he said, looking at the left of the commander. W.R.E looked as well at what he saw would remain burned in his mind for the rest of his days. Clint Stone was there, riding an enormous beast, 30 feet long and 10 feet high, scaled from head to tail. The four-legged beast possessed a huge hooked claws and massive feet, and teeth longer than his forearm burst from its wide mouth. Smoke curled up from its nostrils, and Dewar was not convinced that he was looking at a demon from the deepest circles of hell. Clint struck the beast on the side as it jumped forward, crashing into the back ranks of the swarm. The sheer weight of it crushed several soldiers. The rest opened fire on the beast, but it did nothing to the thick scales that surrounded the beast's flesh. TEDx laughed, and the commander managed to tear his eyes away from the giant monster, decimating his ranks, and looked at TEDx. Dewar did the same. "Do you believe me now?" asked TEDx. The commander stared blankly at him, and TEDx's hand shot forward, grabbing the pistol held limply in the commander's hand. He turned it around and fired, hitting the commander in the chest. The commander's face lost all emotion and collapsed face first into the drop of the fens, hitting the ground with a squelch. TEDx stood over his body. "If you say you're going to kill someone, do it. If you don't, their friend might just show up riding a dragon and save them." Dewar turned back to the beast and Clint, who were in the middle of massacring the swarm, and stared. "This is the beast that Jem had named the dragon after. The ship was the war hunters used for their missions." TEDx stepped up to him and pushed the rifle into his hands. "Don't just stand there. We have swarm to kill," he said before clambering up the earthen bank and diving into the mass of panicked swarm. Dewar looked at the rifle, at Clint riding a dragon, and at the swarm. He climbed up the slope and dived in after TEDx. I stood in the middle of the bodies of swarm. Clint and his Lord Foozy had made short work of them. Dewar and I had accounted for a few, me more so than him. I think he was still in awe of the giant lizard that had just shown up and killed a few hundred swarm. I have to admit, if I had not seen Lord Foozy before, I probably would have done the same reaction. The swarm never had, and it only took a few hundred dead before they broke ranks and scattered for as far corners of the world. And stood by the Lord Foozy, patting the beast on the neck, and wandered over. "It wouldn't come any closer if I were you," Clint said. I stopped dead in my tracks. He climbed off the Lord Foozy, swinging his leg over his side and sliding down the scaled side. He held tightly onto a chain wrapped around the lizard's neck and into its mouth. He stepped in front of the beast and stared into its eyes. The Lord Foozy blinked and turned his head downward. "Good boy," Clint said. He flicked his wrist, releasing the chain and unraveling from the dragon's neck. "Get out of here, you magnificent bastard." Lord Foozy did so, bounding off to the mountains in the distance. Dewar stared in awe. At Clint or the Lord Foozy, I could not tell, really. Then walking over to Clint, I asked, "How did you do that?" Clint shook his head, as if pulling himself out of a dream. "The Lord Foozy, if you get past the claws and scales of carnivorous nature, are not too different from an animal on Earth, called a horse. Humans used to ride them all the time. All you have to do is show them who's boss." I didn't think that I'd be able to show Lord Foozy who was boss, even if I was high out of my mind on flow. I shook my head. Every time I thought I understood Clintstone, I learned something new. "We should get back to Jem and the others. They'll probably be needing our help," I said to Clint, and he nodded his agreement, and we left, heading for the carrier. Jem sat at the base ramp leading into the troop carrier. His plan had gone exactly how he had hoped. The swarm had been drawn out of the camp in large enough numbers to allow Dunrell and Dake to finish off the remainder of the swarm and secure the carrier. It had been a simple task to lead the captives into the carrier and away from the swarm. Not that there were many left. Stone and TEDx Jakku had seen to that. One had killed them with a giant gun, and the other had killed them with a giant lizard. He still didn't believe it. Clint Stone had captured a Lord Foozy, reined it in, and ridden it. He had seen Clint climb inside of one that had been to kill it, a much easier task than taming it. Jem did not think on it too much. He had better things to work on, like his wife and his children, safe and well. He was no longer reviled by those who he had once called neighbors. No, now they were calling him a rescuer and a liberator, but he found he did not really care. All that mattered was that his family no longer looked at him with shame. Now they looked at him with pride. He watched as the last of Buria's population climbed aboard the troop carrier. They would be taken to Aldemir, where they would be fed and clothed, and they would either join the rebellion as soldiers, or as those who did not fight, but were just as vital to the war effort. The cooks, the cleaners, the tailors, and the builders, the workers and the farmers. Kira walked down the ramp and sat next to him. She rested her head on his shoulder, and he reached up and rested his hand on hers. Yes, Jem thought, life was looking up. End of chapter. I hope that you enjoyed, and if you did, please consider subscribing. If you wish to support the author, there is a link to the original story, so pop over there and give him your support. If you wish to support this channel, however, there are a few ways to do so. The best and easiest would be to share this video with other people, as well as liking, subscribing, and leaving a comment. All of these things tell the algorithm that this channel is at least vaguely interesting, and that may share it with other people. If you wish to support the channel in some other manner, watching my other videos would also help tremendously. Or, if you really like, there is a link down below to leave a tip, or to join the Patreon. Any and all support is very much appreciated. And I hope that you all have a good one until the next time, and I'll see you then. Cheers.